Hi, everyone, and welcome to Essay Judge Training for Arizona Academic Decathlon. My name is Greta Baranowski, and I am the State Essay Chair. Tonight, we're going to talk a little bit about the essay event, kind of talk through the rubric that you'll be using to score essays, and go through a couple of sample essays. I do want to note to start that if you're unfamiliar with Academic Decathlon, the 10 events in the competition, the 3 levels of students you'll be judging, things like that, you might want to pause, go watch kind of the introductory overview training video first, and then come back to this one. But assuming we're all on the same page with that, let's go ahead and get started. So I just want to talk a little bit about the essay event. So students write the essay before the competition, before the rest of the competition. They do the essay first. And I always say write, but of course students are typing it now. That's what allows us to score remotely from our homes, right? They're all online now. Students type the essays without access to any kind of spell check, grammar check, autocorrect, things like that. So we are going to see some errors in the essays that we score, and that's totally fine. But just know that what you're seeing is really what came out of the student's head. Students can choose from one of 3 prompts that address one or more areas of the curriculum. So it's usually something like there will be one prompt about the literature, maybe one about economics, and one about history, or one that asks students to make connections across various areas of the curriculum. The prompts are not available to students beforehand, so they can't prepare and strategize about what they're going to write. And really, they have to just draw on what they've been studying for the past few months in the Academic Decathlon resource guides and the research they've been doing. So anything that they can show us in terms of specific examples or details or statistics are things that they're remembering there kind of on the fly, spur of the moment, and we really want to give credit for that. Um, Students will have 50 minutes to create a convincing and well-supported essay that addresses whichever one of the 3 prompts that they've chosen. So there's that. So kind of going hand in hand with that, let's talk about some expectations we should have about these essays. These are not going to be perfect essays. Even the essays that score very well are probably going to have 1 or 2 things wrong with them. And that's totally fine. They're written under these very tight timed circumstances. Students don't have access to their study materials there. Mistakes are going to happen. So none of these essays will be perfect, and it's not fair to expect perfection. However, the essay should fully address the prompt, whichever prompt the student has chosen. They should have a clear thesis, provide evidence to support the thesis, and they should be written with mostly correct grammar, spelling, and usage. Like I said, we might not get a totally perfect example of writing here, but it should be easy to understand and easy to follow what the student is trying to say. So next, let's talk about the rubric that we're going to be using for scoring. And this is new for 2023. The rubric that we're going to be using has 10 different domains that relate to different aspects of the essay. And I'll go into a little bit of detail about each of those 10 in just a second, but just kind of as an overview, here we are. The first 7 areas are about the content and development of the essay and the organization of the essay. So kind of what the essay says. And these elements are scored on a scale of 0 to 4 because it's possible for something like an introduction or a conclusion to be missing altogether, and then you could give it a 0. But the last 3 areas of the rubric assess the writing skills used in the essay. So, for example, spelling, grammar, sentence structure, things like that. And these areas are scored on a scale of 1 to 4 because presumably students will demonstrate these skills to some non-zero level, right? It would be pretty amazing if a student could misspell every single word that they wrote or use every single comma incorrectly. But that's almost certainly not going to happen. So 1 to 4. Okay, so moving on. Let's look in a little bit more detail at the different areas of the rubric. So in the content and development area of the rubric, right, we have a number of different domains that we'll go through. To start with, you're going to give a score to the introduction/thesis, and you'll be assessing how engaging it is, if it does more than just restate the prompt, and if it states a clear thesis. You'll also be assessing the essay's response to the prompt as a whole. So how the essay as a larger piece of writing, not just the introduction, responds to the prompt and addresses all parts of it. You'll also be giving a score for the students' use of evidence, which is their ability to provide specific, detailed examples, statistics, facts, any kind of specific details that support and prove their thesis. You're also going to give a score for analysis slash commentary, which is placing evidence in context to support the thesis and kind of explaining why the facts that they've given you support the thesis. You'll give a score for cohesion, which assesses whether the ideas in the essay are equally developed and how they work together to support the thesis. You're going to give a score for organization, which has to do with things like the use of thesis sentences and dividing the essay into paragraphs, how the ideas are ordered in the essay and how they're structured to support the thesis. And finally, you're going to give a score for the closing. And for that area, we're looking at, is it an intentional finish that does more than just restate the essay or restate the thesis, right? So is it something that's intentionally there to kind of wrap up this piece of writing that we've read? So that is the content and development part of the rubric. And now let's look at writing skills. For this part of the rubric, you're going to give a score for word choice slash diction slash voice, which is using the right words for the topic, using varied word choice. You'll score spelling and punctuation, so spelling words correctly, using appropriate punctuation, kind of following the established rules there. And then for grammar and sentence structure, you're going to be scoring whether the essay follows accepted conventions of constructing sentences, using varied and appropriate sentence structure. So that is kind of the writing skills at part of the rubric. And like I said, we'll have a chance to apply these on a couple of sample essays. So no worries if this is a little abstract right now. Okay, so in terms of assigning a score, as I mentioned before, you're going to assign a score for each of those bullet points I mentioned earlier on a scale of either 0 to 4 or 1 to 4. And so I just wanted to spell out what those numbers mean here. So 4 is excellent, superior. 3 is acceptable, effective. 2 is attempted, fair. 1 is barely or minimal, and 0 is insufficient or not present. So kind of to give you an idea of what we'll be using there when we look at the sample essays later. So I want to take just a brief minute to talk about one very special class of essays, the off-prompt essay. An off-prompt essay completely lacks relevant content. It is not anywhere close to any of the prompts that students could have written on. For example, if the prompt asks for examples from 3 poems in the curriculum and the student instead writes about 3 Taylor Swift songs, that's off prompt. If they give you one giant apology for being unprepared for the competition, that's off prompt. This last one is a little tricky, but if the essay is just related to the general curriculum but not the specific prompt, that is off prompt. That one gets a little tricky. Don't be afraid to ask questions of your event coordinator if you're unsure whether an essay is off prompt. And part of the reason I say that is that you'll see on the Google form you use for scoring, there's actually a special option you select for off prompt. And that will give the essay a score of 0 for everything. So that's a big deal to give a student a 0. We want to make sure we're only using the off prompt selection appropriately and when it's really warranted. So off prompt does not mean that the essay is only about part of the prompt or it's a bad essay. That we just score really low using the rubric. But off prompt is kind of its own special case. So like I said, if you run into an essay that you think is off prompt, you're not sure, you can always ask your event coordinator to weigh in on it. So just something to keep in mind. In terms of the prompts, students must address the prompt that they select and respond to all aspects of it. In order to help us as judges make sure that students are doing this, we have response guidelines that are provided to us at each competition. These are kind of cheat sheets, kind of background info about each of the prompts to help us, if it's a novel that you haven't read before, or you're not familiar with this time in history, it's just to kind of give you some background information and help you understand what you're looking for in these essays. They're not intended to be answer keys per se. So it's not like when you read the response guidelines, it's a checklist for, you know, students have to include every single piece of information here or else they get a bad score. That's not the case. Every essay can kind of be evaluated on a case-by-case basis as to how effectively it addresses the prompt. And it's entirely possible that students might come up with, for example, examples from the literature that are not listed on the response guidelines. So the response guidelines are intended to be helpful to us as judges, but they're not the definition of a good essay. So just always like to make that clear. So we're not thinking that the response guidelines are the end all and be all of an essay. So now for the good part. Let's look at some sample essays. There are 2 sample essays in a PDF on the website. So I will give you guys a second to go ahead and pull those up and we'll get started. Okay, so I've pulled up the sample essays here, and I also have the essay evaluation form here. And so, you will be engaging with this as a Google form or the form on a website where you can kind of select numbers for these. This is just kind of a hard copy version of it, but it should be pretty easy to transfer to your competition. So let's take a look at these essays. So I'm going to start by just kind of giving some general thoughts about this essay, and then we can look at applying the rubric to it. So this essay is overall fairly strong, not the greatest essay I've ever read, but that's fine. It has some good details, some good examples. I wish it was more detailed in some ways, perhaps providing, for example, names of actors that were cast in Porgy and Bess, or more details about when exactly all of this took place. But overall, it has some specific information. It's well organized. It addresses the prompt, and it has a clear conclusion. And then in terms of its writing, it's got a few errors, a few kind of missteps in spelling and punctuation, but nothing that really gets in the way of my ability to understand the essay. So I'm pulling up the essay evaluation form, and let's just walk through this. For the introduction/thesis, and I'm going to look at my notes over here to make sure I'm right about this. So for this one, it's not the most amazing introduction, but it gets the job done and it provides a little bit of context and tells me where the essay is going to go. So I would give this a 3. In terms of response to prompt, this prompt is not asking for a specific number of body points or anything like that. And the student does respond pretty comprehensively to the prompt. I would give a 4 here. Evidence is where this essay falls a little bit short. It has some specifics, maybe not as many as I would like to see. Like I said, I'd love to see names of actors. I'd love to see more kind of specifics, like a quote from a civil rights leader responding to Porgy and Bess or something like that. So I would probably give a 2 for that. Analysis and commentary, kind of a similar idea. Are the ideas explained effectively? I think the student could do a better job here. I would probably give a 2. For cohesion, all of the points relate back to the thesis. I feel like all of the assertions are pretty equally developed. I would give a 3. Organization, yes, all the paragraphs have topic sentences. There's some good use of transitions. Maybe could use a little more linkage between paragraphs, but overall strong. I would go for a 3 here. For closing, we do have an intentional finish, but it is a little bit repetitive. It's pretty repetitive, but it does get the job done. I would probably give it a 2. So, and then if we look at the writing skills components of the rubric, overall, the diction is appropriate to the topic, and I felt like the student demonstrated pretty good mastery of the language they were using. I would go for a 3. For spelling and punctuation, yes, there are a few spelling errors or typos, but nothing that really got in the way of my ability to understand what the student was trying to argue. And I felt kind of the same way about punctuation, where there was nothing that made me stop and really question or guess. So I would go for a 3. For grammar and sentence structure, overall strong control, overall good varied sentence structures, and good command of all of those skills. So again, a 3. So when we enter the score, our raw score is out of 40. It's multiplied by 25 to yield the final score out of 1,000. So in this case, that would yield a score of, I believe, 675 or 700. Uh, so that is that's a decent score, right? Which I feel like matches up with this essay, um, which is decent but not totally amazing. So let's take a look at sample essay number 2. I'll pause the recording for just a second and be right back. Okay, so looking at sample essay number 2, this one is, sorry if you guys can hear my dog harumphing a little bit. This one is a little bit shorter. It's got a very different prompt, but that's kind of good. Gives you an example of the different types of prompts that you can run into. This one asks students to discuss the mentality during the Cold War. And so let's just take a look at this, right? And again, I'll kind of give my overall thoughts, and then we can look at the rubric. So this is an essay that is overall not very specific. It doesn't have a great thesis that tells me where it's going to go. It doesn't have a lot of specific evidence. It throws out some things here and there, like mentioning the Marshall Plan. I don't know about you guys. I don't know what the Marshall Plan is. Couldn't tell you. So that example is a little lost on me, and a good example of where we could have used some more analysis and commentary from the student. So, and then the end, this is an essay that just kind of stops, just kind of falls off a cliff in a way. It doesn't really have a deliberate conclusion. It just kind of, the student probably ran out of time, or, just ran out of things to say alternatively. So not a lot of conclusion there. So if we go to the rubric and look at this, for our introduction, there is some sort of introduction. It doesn't do a great job of stating a thesis, but it is an introduction. I would give it a 2 probably. For response to prompt, there is an attempt at responding to the prompt and kind of addressing that. Again, probably a 2. For evidence, there's not much evidence here. There are some general statements about things that were going on during the time, but we don't have a lot of specific facts and details here. I would give this a 1. Likewise, for analysis, we've got some general statements, but it's hard to have analysis when we don't have a lot of evidence also, and just not a lot of support there for it. So probably, again, a 1. For cohesion, I think focus is where this essay struggles. It just doesn't feel like it really focuses on a point. And so I would probably give it a 1 for cohesion. For organization, I think we have one topic sentence in there, but it's a little bit hard to tell. We just don't know what the paragraphs are trying to do. I would probably give a 1 for organization. For closing, I would probably try to give the student 1 point just for having something that I can think of as a conclusion, but honestly, it's not much of an intentional finish, and it's not much of anything to wrap up the essay. And it's probably fairest to give a 0 for that. In terms of word choice and diction, overall, the voice got a little bit confused for me at times. I wasn't always sure about it. And just some repetition of word choice in there, probably a 2 is what I would give. For spelling and punctuation, I did notice more errors in this one, and I did see more places where I had to kind of stop and think about the punctuation that either was used or should be used, and kind of do more work there. So I would give that a 2. And kind of likewise for grammar and sentence structure. We've got some varied sentence structure, but there were some sentences where, I had to kind of stop and think about what the student was trying to say, kind of do some work there on my own. So a little bit of lack of control there. I would give it 2 for that. So again, that gives us a raw score of, I believe, 15, which is a score of 375 on this rubric, which I think is probably fair for this essay. So that is um, kind of it. Let me know if you have any questions or talk to your event coordinator, but I hope this has been helpful. Thank you so much for volunteering to score essays for Arizona Academic Decathlon, and I hope you enjoy it.